My grandfather only had one rule when I was growing up in Puerto Rico. Never go into the woods after sundown. He said it all the time, but he never explained why. At the time, I assumed it was just one of those old rural superstitions. I didn't realize until I was 14 that he meant it very seriously. I grew up in Fajardo, a beach town on the eastern side of Puerto Rico. Most people think about the ocean when they hear that name. Boats, fishing docks, ferries heading to the smaller islands. But if you actually grow up there, you learn pretty quickly that the ocean isn't the only thing surrounding the town. Behind the neighborhoods and houses, the land turns into thick forest and hills. The woods start just past the last row of houses. Once you get into them, the trees grow close together. The ground becomes uneven, and once the sun goes down, it gets dark in a way that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it. I lived with my dad growing up, but my grandparents were our next-door neighbors, so I spent a lot of time at their house whenever my dad was working. That meant my grandfather was around almost every day of my life. He wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to believe in anything supernatural. When he was younger, he had been around 6 feet 3 inches, though by the time I knew him, old age had brought him closer to 6 feet. He was still broad-shouldered and imposing, the kind of man who looked like he had spent his entire life doing hard work. He served in the U.S. Army for about a decade, starting in the late 1940s. And after leaving the service, he worked a number of jobs before eventually opening a small bodega in New York during the 1970s. Later, he moved back to Puerto Rico. He wasn't superstitious, which is why the rule always felt strange. Every evening, he would sit on the balcony in a long blue and white hospital chair he had because of circulation problems in his legs. From there, he could see the street and the houses across from us. The woods were behind the houses, out of view. Still, almost every day at some point, he would repeat the same warning. Never go into the woods after sundown. He never explained why. One evening when I was about 14, one of my best friends came over. The sun was already starting to dip behind the hills. The sky had that deep orange color that tells you night is coming soon. He asked if we could go explore, and he meant the woods. Normally, I would have asked my grandfather if it was okay, but that time I didn't. I knew what he would say. So instead, I just told him we were going out for a walk. As we were leaving through the gate, he called out to me from the balcony, "Don't go into the woods after sundown." The words caught me off guard. I hadn't said anything about the woods. For a moment, I wondered if he somehow knew. I laughed it off and said we wouldn't. But the warning stayed in the back of my mind. We went into the woods anyway. At first, everything felt normal. We followed one of the trails we had walked plenty of times before. The coqui frogs were chirping, and the trees moved gently with the evening breeze. Eventually, the light faded until moonlight was the only thing lighting the path. After a while, my friend said he needed to take a leak, so he stepped off the trail and walked a little deeper between the trees. I waited. 1 minute passed, then another, then a few more. Something about the woods suddenly felt different, quieter, too quiet. So I stepped off the trail and went looking for him. Instead of finding him, I walked straight into a clearing. At first, I thought I recognized it. There was a small open spot in the woods where one of the neighbors had thrown a party once when I was younger. I remembered music, people drinking, a fire pit in the middle. But something about this clearing didn't feel right. The one I remembered was small, maybe 20 feet across at most. this one was much bigger. The tree line stretched farther out than I remembered, forming a wide circle around me. For a moment, I wondered if I'd somehow walked to a completely different place, but I didn't remember there being any other clearings nearby, and standing in the middle of it was a figure. At first, I thought it was my friend, so I called his name. No response. I walked farther out of the trees, thinking maybe he just couldn't hear me. By the time I realized something was wrong, I was already deep in the clearing. The figure slowly turned around, and suddenly I realized I was less than 10 feet away. It wasn't my friend. It was an old woman. From the edge of the clearing, she had looked tall, but up close, she looked small and frail. Her skin was pale, and her hair was white as snow, hanging loosely around her shoulders. Her expression is something I still struggle to describe. The best way I can explain it is this. She looked angry. Not normal anger. Something deeper. Something that made her face look almost possessed. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then she lifted her hands. The way she moved them didn't look normal. They moved too fast, too sharply for someone who looked that old. Almost like her body didn't match the way she was moving. She started murmuring something under her breath. I couldn't understand the words. At the same time, the wind suddenly picked up around the clearing. Not a breeze. A sudden rush of air that pushed through the trees and made the branches bend. Then the temperature dropped. Anyone who's been to Puerto Rico knows how strange that is. Even at night, the air is warm. But suddenly the cold hit my chest when I breathed. The wind got stronger. The trees around the clearing started swaying. And the entire time she kept moving her hands in the air, murmuring something I couldn't understand. Fear completely took over. I shut my eyes and braced myself for something to happen. But after a few seconds, everything stopped. The wind died instantly. The cold disappeared. The sounds of the forest slowly returned. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. She was gone. It took almost an hour before my friend and I finally found each other again. According to him, he had never moved from the spot where he stepped off the trail. He said 1 minute I was standing there, and the next minute I was gone. We walked out of the woods quickly. The entire time it felt as if something was watching us from between the trees. But the moment we stepped out under the street lights, that feeling disappeared. When I got home, my grandfather was still on the balcony. At first he looked angry that I had stayed out so late, but the moment he saw my face, his expression changed. "You're pale. What happened?" he asked. I told him everything. When I finished, he slowly turned and looked toward the dark line of houses that stood between us in the woods. For the first time in my life, that big, tough man looked pale. Finally, he spoke. "Brujas, witches." He immediately went inside and started closing the windows, every single one. Then he locked the doors. That wasn't something he normally did. Not like that. Before I left for my house next door, I looked back through the doorway. My grandfather was sitting alone in the living room. And for the first time in a long time, I saw him praying the rosary. After that night, we never talked about what happened in the woods again, and he never repeated the rule. He didn't have to. Because from that night on, I understood exactly why he said it. Some places change after the sun goes down. And whatever I saw that night is the reason I will never go into the woods after sundown again. Alaskan Airlines Flight 261. This is a story my mom has told me for years. Before I was born, my parents were stuck in the Puerto Vallarta airport trying to get back to Chicago, and their United flight kept getting delayed over and over. After hours of waiting, like almost 18 total, they were exhausted and sleeping on the floor, and my mom finally begged my dad to just get on a different flight. There was an Alaska Airlines flight going to Seattle, and she just wanted to be back in the US and figure it out from there. My dad immediately refused and kept saying, "I'm not getting on that plane," which my mom always thought was weird because he's not usually like that. She was sitting there crying, watching people board, wishing she was getting on too. And she said she noticed this little girl, probably around 4, with blonde curly hair, wearing a white sundress, walking onto the plane. My mom said seeing her weirdly made her feel better for a second, like everything was okay, even though she was upset. The plane left, and eventually my parents got on a different flight home. When they landed, they found out that Alaska Airlines Flight 261 had crashed, and everyone on board died. My mom said she cried for days, especially thinking about that little girl she saw. What's always stuck with me is that if they had gotten on that flight, I wouldn't exist, which is already crazy, but also I've tried looking through victim lists and photos, and I can't find anyone that matches the little girl my mom described. If anyone knows where to find a full victims list with pictures or anything, that would be great, just so I can visualize this creepy story my mom has always told me. I was a registered tow truck operator for about 2 years. It was a great job. Pay was good, lots of overtime, and on-call shifts. I got into the career because of shows I watched as a kid, like Highway Through Hell. So when I got the chance to go in to the field, I jumped on it. The first month was good. I learned a lot of experience and new skills. Part of our job as RTTO was emergency calls with police and fire for crash scenes and impounds. So we saw a lot of tragic stuff: DUI fatality, hit and runs, non-DUI fatalities act. The job can be very emotionally and mentally draining and can mess you up if you're not careful. However, there's another kind of aspect to the job not a lot of drivers talk about: the paranormal, odd stuff, or calls that unsettles you. Almost every tow truck driver has experienced it. It was a snowy, cold November night in 2023. We didn't get a lot of calls that day, so I was just chilling at the shop for my on-call shift. The night was going very slowly. We hadn't gotten any calls for hours. So I lay down for a bit, not expecting to get any call for night. Then all of a sudden I get a call for a broken down WSP, Washington State Patrol car off this dirt road. I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't wired for me, since I've gotten a few calls like it before, so I hop in my flatbed and drive up to the call's location. The directions took me a good 30-ish minutes outside of the city to the mountains on I-90. By the time I get off the freeway, it was super foggy and very hard to see, so I took it slow and easy to be safe. I keep driving up the now dirt mountain road, and then I start to thinking to myself that this is a really odd road for WSP to be on, since they usually stay on the interstates and state highways. I didn't think much of it when I first got the call, because staters and sheriffs do occasionally go out on the more remote roads, but the road I was going on was an unpaved dirt logging road. There was nothing out here, just an old logging road and trees. I try to rationalize it to myself that maybe the cop was just out here for an abandoned car, which would explain why he is all the way out here, since cars do get left and abandoned out here often. So I just shrug it off and continue my way up the road. I finally get to the location and stop the truck dead in its tracks and just sit there for a minute. What the hell, I think to myself. The WSP car was parked out on this mountain road with all its doors open and no lights on, with no officers in sight. It was so foggy I really could only see the car, but it was clear to me that no one was in sight. I very heavily contemplated just turning around and going back, but I eventually decided to hop out and inspect the car and look for the officer, since he could have been injured after all. So I hopped out of the truck and grabbed my AR with my sidearm holstered, since I had no idea what I was about to walk into. I walked up to the car very cautiously. Just because I had my guns on did not make the situation feel any better nor safer. I first check out the driver's seat, then the passenger seat. Odd, I think to myself, nothing is missing. It was like everything was frozen in time. At this point, I'm starting to get a strange feeling like something is off, that when I look into the trunk of the car and notice the AR is missing, I immediately freeze up and look around. As I'm looking around, that's when I noticed that the forest was dead. Quite no wind, no nothing. I have seen a lot of messes up stuff, dead bodies, entire families killed in one accident act, but I was completely unnerved. Something inside me was telling me to get the hell out of there. I managed to gather the composure to do a walk around one more time, just to make sure I didn't miss anything. Then I called my dispatcher just to make sure I had the right location and information, and sure enough, everything was correct. At that point, I was ready as hell to get out as fast as possible. Right before I turned the truck around, I yelled out just to see if I'd get a response, but nothing but dead since came back. Something is deeply wrong. And with this, I said to myself and booked it out of there. The whole drive back, I had this sick feeling like I stumbled across something I was absolutely not supposed to see, or if I was even supposed to be there. I keep thinking why the cop was all the way out there, why he left the car, or why all the doors were wide open, or if it was even a cop in the first place. More or less, why only the AR was missing when thousands of dollars worth of equipment was in that car. Once I got back to the shop, I called the police dispatcher that gave us the call. Since I knew her, I was hoping she could give some answers. But no, she said the exact same thing that was said to me, that a WSP car was broken down and just needed a tow. I never told my supervisor or anyone else out of fear that they wouldn't believe me. I mean, I wouldn't if I were them.